Mr. Bryan Ross, at long last, we get the chance to speak. I know this has been a long time in the making, this podcast to talk about cloud native and Kubernetes, but it's good to finally talk to you, mate. How are you?
Likewise, fella. It's been too long. I'm doing fantastic, mate. Really, really enjoying my new role, and it's nice to see your face again.
Yeah, well, where do you want to start, dude? Do you want to introduce yourself? Do you want me to introduce you?
Well, let me do that. So, hello everyone. My name is Bryan Ross. I currently am a executive advisor in the VMware Tanzu team, where my job is to work with execs in VMware's top accounts or must-win accounts, and really just help people towards their business initiatives. So, although I'm involved in Tanzu, I'm not directly in sales or that. So, my goal really is to help people get things done with computers faster. So that might be large app modernization, that might be digital transformation, that might be cloud native, that might be a bunch of buzzwords. We can talk about any of them, but really it's about how do we get business value out of all this stuff. And by the way,
Right.
that's not technology, it's usually people as well, right? As we both know, Will.
Yeah, well, I think the industry is built on buzzwords, and there's a lot of buzzwords that I see floating about that. I mean, I've been doing this for 12 years in tech recruitment, and even still now, I kind of don't really know what's beneath the surface. And a lot of people like are going cloud native now. There's applications born in the cloud, and there's all these. What is cloud native? If you imagine you're talking to my mom, and you want to help her understand what cloud native is, what do you say?
So I think fundamentally it just means that your application or your service has been designed from the ground up to run in the cloud. It's as simple as that. So what does that really mean? It means that you might be able to run it in Amazon or Google or on-prem. And if you're using something like that, you're probably going to be using new technologies, which brings other buzzwords like Kubernetes or containers and these kind of buzzwords. But
Yeah.
fundamentally, it's about your application being able to run anywhere where you want to put it.
Yeah. Okay. So containers. When you say the word containers, I immediately think of a big ship going over the ocean with all the containers on. I mean, is there any parallels to draw from that?
Do you know, I think that's actually a really good analogy. So if you imagine a container ship, it's got all these containers. That's much easier than trying to pack fridges and cars and food and all sorts of products onto this boat, right? So a container is like a set standard size, and that means the boat's designed to carry those containers. But it also means when you get to any port in the world, all the cranes are designed to lift that standard container off and on the ships. And it means the trucks as well, which are delivering it to local distribution centers, they're all designed to carry containers. So it's a standard way of moving things around. And it's no different in the IT world. The idea is you put your application and all the bits that it needs into this container, and you should be able to take that and run it anywhere.
Okay. Okay. So if we stick to the analogy, then what would Kubernetes be in that environment?
So Kubernetes in that environment really, I think, is the collection of tools. So if you imagine the shipping industry
Hmm.
is all of those things. So you need something that's going to to put something to build the container, right? So you need containers in the first place. So you have tools like Image Builder, which will put that together. You then need to have some way of getting it into the cloud, right? So that's normally the platform that you'd have. So you might be using some kind of some tool like Tanzu, for example, include
Hmm.
some products for
Yeah.
that. Let's
Nice.
not
Hmm.
be
Yeah.
beat about bush. But that is using Kubernetes really as just the language. And I think that's the big thing about Kubernetes. I don't really tend to think of it as a technology as such, but instead it's more like a universal language. It's a standard that we can all follow.
Mm.
So in other words, you might have your Kubernetes running in Amazon and Kubernetes running in Google and Kubernetes running on your laptop. They should all work fundamentally the same way, even though they're entirely different boats at the end of the day. So Kubernetes isn't one part, it's really that entire ecosystem.
Yeah, and I hear and see on social media a lot of people posting about how complicated Kubernetes is. So, I mean, if it were a language, I think it would be Martian or Vulcan or whatever crazy language you could think. But I understand now that it's starting to iterate and it's starting to move forwards. In what I saw the other day, which was 1.25, which a lot of people have been getting quite excited about. I mean, what does it mean in terms of Kubernetes going forward? Is it task to become simpler? Are people trying to make it easy to install and work with and understand it more importantly? What's the crack? What's next?
So I think we can't shy away from the fact that that it is complicated. Kubernetes and shipping, using that analogy and flogging it to death, is complicated. So if you think about security in a container world, how do you know what got put into that container and got put in the ship? How do you know where it's going to come off? How do you do all the auditing behind that? How do you deal with customs and all these things, right? Everything we deal with in the physical world, it's big. And I think it'd be really interesting to have a chat with someone who does physical shipping of containers and compare that to the digital world, right? But so I think that the moving forward, what we're going to end up with for technology is what we always do: layers of abstraction. So I get asked a lot of the time, what's a Tanzu and how do we get a Tanzu? And the best way of explaining that is it is that set of tools, those set of abstractions to just try and make Kubernetes easier. So it's about, well, I've got this thing I want to put a container. Great, well, let us take care of that for you. It'd be like using a shipping company rather than you trying to get all these things yourself. Like, it's entirely doable, but you're going to have to work through a lot of process and a lot of difficult things. So I think what we'll find is just more and more tools built on top of containers rather than Kubernetes itself becoming much easier, in my humble opinion.
And can every enterprise have access to that? If you're a 10-man gaming company, for example, or if you're a 100,000 person shipping container company who needs to build or update to a cloud native application stack, can everybody have access to it or to Tanzu?
Yes, well, 100%. So, and I would say as well, other Kubernetes are available, and other technologies are available too. So anyone can get access to that. So you can check out the Tanzu website, and I'll give you all details about how you can get involved. There's things like trials and stuff available as well too. I would say though as well, like, it's important that we don't all rush necessarily to containers all at once. Like, in some ways, if what you're trying to do is send a package to your mum that's in the same country, then maybe you don't need to put that in a shipping container and organize it to be moved with a full truck with a whole bunch of other containers if it's just going to a local place. In other words, you can do quite a lot with what would now be considered standard or traditional technologies. So try not to overcomplicate your stack, but at the same time, if you are doing big things and you want to be able to work at scale, containers, I think, are going to be the way that happens. And I think if you want to do that at scale, Kubernetes is the best standard to follow so that you can work with other tools and other things in that ecosystem.
And where did it come from initially? If you think of the journey that it's been on, and if you kind of reverse engineer Kubernetes to, I don't know where it started personally. I don't know where it is today. But where would it have started, do you think, to start moving? Right, okay, we need to think about containers. We need to think about Kubernetes platforms. Where would that have been?
So the concepts of containers go right back to the histories of Linux. And we used to have a thing called jailed roots and things like that before. But really, Kubernetes, as it's known, comes from Google. They had a large system called Borg that they used to organize all the applications in their data center, and it was a platform that their development teams could use to run apps. And I think that really there's two things about Kubernetes. I think that Google had to do something, right? Because Amazon were taking over the standard for the language used to describe infrastructure. EC2 was so incredibly popular that it was becoming the standard, and all the tools were coming around that ecosystem. So Google had to do something, and I think that releasing Kubernetes did two things. I think, first of all, it changed public cloud fundamentally from being, monopolistic to some extent, where you've got different cloud providers that don't play nicely necessarily with one another. The idea is to get you into their cloud so you can stay there, whereas Kubernetes now releases that, and now we have an ability for portability. But most importantly, it gives Google their name is out there now. There's now a technology that they can get involved in. That being said, they've been really, really kind. That is now an open source project. It's run by a separate board outside of Google, and that's now taken on a life of its own. And in fact, I think we can look at Kubernetes in the same way we look at the Linux kernel. Like, it's beyond any one company now. It's a standard that we all contribute to, that we all use, and we can all benefit from.
And do you think that's why perhaps it won't ever end up as a bolt-on or as an additional product to, an AWS infrastructure or a Google Cloud infrastructure? It won't ever just be as like a bolt-on sold as part of a big refresh. Like you see a lot of startups and a lot of companies bringing, specific Kubernetes platforms to the market. Do you think that's ever going to be a risk?
So I think people will continue to sell some kind of Kubernetes as a service for a period at very least. I think Amazon as well, like they were kind of slow to the Kubernetes game, but that's largely because they were trying to sell services on top of containers rather than giving people direct access to containers. In my humble opinion, I don't think it's great that developers are using Kubernetes directly. Like we don't really want, we shouldn't have all that plumbing exposed to developers. It should be much easier. Like in some ways, our move to containers is a step backwards from the days of PaaS, platform as a service, using tools like Cloud Foundry, which was really easy, like the fastest way of getting an application from your head into version control and then out into production. But running a Cloud Foundry platform was pretty complicated. I think Kubernetes makes that more commodity, so more people get involved. But by exposing all those sharp edges, we've made developers' jobs harder, and that's why these new tools need to come and sit on top. So I think Kubernetes will be part of everyone's industry. Much like today, I think it is really difficult to find a company that's not running some kind of vSphere estate. Even if they're all public cloud and doing groovy things, there'll be some vSphere boxes sitting somewhere, right? It's just become part of our tool chain that everybody uses. Kubernetes will be the same, I think.
And what are you seeing about the adoption of Kubernetes, in terms of the client base that you've been exposed to? Are you seeing that people are quite welcoming and quite open-minded to bringing it into their infrastructure, or are they a bit hesitant because of the complexity?
So I think that, in fact, the reports, so State of DevOps and other reports like that, show that the rise of use of containers, Docker, Kubernetes, all of these related tools has just been skyrocketing. I actually think the biggest challenge is that because it's so accessible, that a number of companies are finding that their IT departments, their development teams, they've all been playing and trying this new technology because it's all really exciting to begin with, right? And then before you know it, you're running something in prod and it might be shadow IT. And now it's not the problem that you're trying to bring Kubernetes into your estate. The problem is that it's already there and you've already got 5 or 10 or 50 of these Kubernetes platforms running, but you don't have visibility of them. And perhaps they've not been built to your corporate standards because you probably don't have corporate standards for containers yet. So I think that's the problem really most companies are facing now, is that it's not so much should we do Kubernetes, it's how do we try and manage the Kubernetes we've already got and build a strategy around it so we can move forward at the same kind of pace, but with perhaps some sensible guardrails and bumpers around it so we're not doing silly things. It was the same as public cloud, right? Everyone ran out with a credit card to AWS and Google, spent a whole bunch of money doing things.
Yeah.
Then we had some data breaches, and now companies are tailing back a little bit. And it's not stopping public cloud. It's just about trying to put some sensible controls and audit around it.
And what's been your personal experience? Because I know previously you had quite an interesting journey in your previous employer, where you adopted new technologies. You built some of your own, if I remember right. So talk to me a little bit about your journey in terms of how you've had to adapt and kind of integrate new technologies into perhaps legacy infrastructure and use the Kubernetes of the day, as it were. Talk to me about your journey there.
Yeah, sure. So I previously worked at Sky TV. I was there for 10 years solid, so a really long time. And I was heading up their technology products area. So we built cloud platforms for development teams all across Sky to underpin all the TV, broadcast, media, everything at Sky running on these cloud platforms. And it's the same kind of problem that everyone else has. Developers do their own thing to get their application running, and then we need to try and centralize that to make it more secure, more efficient, more audited, and all the rest of it. I think the biggest challenge is not the technology. I think that people can install Kubernetes quite happily. I think they can get it running, and they can probably do a decent job of it. The question really is around efficiency, first and foremost. If we're all spending our time trying to develop and build this platform, is that detracting us from building great applications, which is really what we want to be doing? Likewise, if we have experts in building applications, but we've got experts in security and compliance and everything else, how do we really bake all that into one platform if it's being built in maybe in the wrong places? So I think that the big challenge really is really about people. How do we build platforms that encourage the right behavior? I'm a big believer in the path of least resistance. If you can make your solution better, and I don't mean cheaper, I mean better for the person, easier to use, more attractive in some ways, then it will become popular, it will grow. And that was certainly the experience at Sky. We started off with your traditional enterprise, and over the years we moved into automated VM deployments. That then meant that developers didn't have to hold on to old VMs, to make their lives faster. So we managed to delete as many VMs as we built, which was great because there's no more old stuff kicking about. Containers, very similar. Lots of people really excited about this technology, but it moves really quickly. And also as well, there's a lot of movement of people just now, right? Especially over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
That's been a big challenge too, because you might have contractors that have come in, they've built this brand new application on this brand new Kubernetes stack, and now they've moved on to a different project or a different company, and those skills have been lost. Or it's just not something you want to be doing. So I think it's really a challenge of people and efficiency and trying to corral a common strategy for this. And I think that's really important as well. If you want that portability, the ability to run this application on your laptop, in your dev environment, on-premise, public cloud, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, wherever, you need to bring that strategy together so that people feel they can trust it and they know the right things being done. And likewise, we need to be able to include things like compliance, audit, security, governance without getting in the way. We can do that with containers. We can do that with things like Tanzu application platform, which is built for it, a pipeline to do all these things automatically, but we need to corral everyone together. So it's not really a technology problem, in my humble opinion. It's people, but that's nothing new for technology, right?
As always, it's always down to people. I mean, on the, I suppose, the subject of people, how did you overcome the challenge of innovation and innovating in a large organization as Sky is? I can imagine there's a lot of red tape, and I can imagine there's a lot of hoops to jump through, bringing new technologies and trying radical ideas on way of doing things. How did you overcome that challenge?
So I've got to say, Sky was always great at innovation. Being a media company, there's a certain desire to be first, to do new things. So I think that first and foremost, having the backing to be innovative and do new things is good. In terms of making it successful, I think there's a few key things you can do. Number one, talk about what you're doing. Be open about it. Run as an internal blog. Run weekly sessions, drop-in sessions, so people can learn what you're up to, especially it involves new tools that other people might be interested in. Be open. Engage with people. I think you need to be realistic as well about what it is you're going to build. So I don't think you start off by building a huge shipping container ship, right? And huge cranes. I think you maybe want to start small and add on to it. So if we think back to, but I would think back to the first platform that I built in Sky, which was around VMs, day one, it deployed a single Windows non-production machine to one of Sky's data centers. That's all it did. And it only met less than 10% of the overall use cases. But once we got that down, we were able to then move on to other things. So I think build incrementally is really important, and listen to your users as you're building. And this leads me to the last one, which is really passionate for me, which is now, I was bleating on about this for years, but I think it's now basically called platform as a product. And that is, stop thinking like an IT department. Stop thinking like a cost center, and start thinking about you as being a company within your company. Like, you don't have consumers, you've got customers. So if the developers want something, you need to think about how you're going to make that happen within the constructs of the safety of the company. And so, I did a podcast recently with Michael Cote around this, and we talked about the analogy of going into a supermarket and trying to buy some sugar. Like, there's a really different experience for customers if you're told, well, sugar's on aisle 4, go help yourself, versus someone walking you to that aisle, asking you what it is you're trying to make with the sugar, finding out that it's your daughter's birthday party, and then talking about whether they want candles and banners and things as well, right? It's a very different experience. And I think that almost that selling, I think, is uncomfortable for a lot of people in IT, but it's something we need to embrace. Can't do technology without people, because people's where the value gets delivered. And if you're not delivering value, unfortunately, there's now plenty of other options for businesses to look at.
I think this is where the market has and is going. What I'm seeing now is a huge shift in terms of how companies approach their sales process to dev companies, in as much as they're going from a bottom-up approach, like a PLG kind of approach, and they're selling they're not even selling. They're educating dev teams, exactly like you said. Build the blogs, build the tutorials on YouTube, and use Concord, use the platforms that developers go and use to educate dev teams, platform engineers, SREs on how to use something that's going to make their life easier. And I think that's been a market shift that I've seen in the last 2 years, really, with a lot of companies that I'm working with and helping them build and scale. They're now coming to market with what's called DevRel, like a dev relations consultant or a dev advocate, someone who advocates technology into dev communities. And they're not leading with that big, hard-hitting salesperson who's got the big Rolodex of contract. I'm going to call straight into this, whatever. It seems to be a little transitioning slightly away from that. And I'm sure that's what you're seeing now in your role existing in the first place. A value advisor is a role that I didn't see 2 years ago, and has perhaps been in the last year that I've seen a company like Tanzu put such importance on that communication, that bringing the value prop to life in the dev community. And I suppose it's quite an interesting transition from you at 10 years at Sky into this, I suppose it is a mixture of roles, isn't it? It's a dev role, yours, while it's a dev advocacy role, whilst at the same time, it's a not quite a sales role, but like a solutions advisor of sorts. What's your thoughts on the emergence of your role?
So, I think it's been around for a long time, but without doubt, the popularity of it has only really come recently. So coming back to VMware, I was really careful after working at Sky for so long and loving Sky, by the way. It's one of the best companies I've ever worked for. I was really careful about where I wanted to go, and it was all about culture for me. And if you think about the history of Tanzu, it really comes from the Pivotal company and Cloud Foundry. And the Pivotal guys and gals were out there talking about transformation and involving people and pairing years ago. But it's now, I think, with everything to do with DevOps, I think that was a really good start. We start talking about bringing groups of people together rather than siloing them. I think that Kubernetes has helped, largely part of as a language that we can now use to talk. We have a common language between dev and ops and security now. Great. But I think more importantly, we're beginning to understand that people have changed. So it's not just how we do technology. I think if we look at the broader industry, it's about engaging with customers. I think for some companies, including Sky, by the way, and VMware and Tanzu, I think that that's always been core to what they do. Whereas I think for some others where it's been, no, we've got product to sell, and it coming from a sales background, I think it's the world's changing without doubt. I think people are now, particularly as technology emerges into their own homes, they're used to getting a really high level of service. And I think that now we see the rise of subscription-based software. So you need to be able to demonstrate value, not that one time in that one sales pitch, possibly after that nice lunch. Now you need to be able to deliver your value every year and show improvement. And I think that's great for companies because it means that we can show innovation. But I think it's great for customers too, because A, you've got choice, and B, you can really get started with something, as you were saying, without having to buy the entire lot, right?
Yeah, and I think obviously a lot of that has been driven, of course, by people being, I suppose, forced into their homes for an extended period of time to use technology. And I think, crisis typically drives innovation in certain regards. And I'm sure a lot of the companies who are, probably the platform that you and I are talking on now had to scramble to perhaps create a more efficient version of their application, which undoubtedly led them perhaps down a Kubernetes path. Would you think?
Quite possibly. I think as well, like we had to change a lot of things all at once. And I think people went through a bit of change too, right? I think we all needed something to kind of get ourselves stuck into. So I think there would have been opportunity there for transformation. And alongside the changes in workforce, so if we're now looking at a remote workforce, then that changes the way we all work together, right? So 5 years ago, we were all talking about stand-ups and meeting at 10 o'clock every morning to stand in front of the whiteboard and move bits of paper around. That's not going to work anymore, right? So now we're talking about distributed systems. And it's almost like version control. But previously, we'd have a file share with some code on it, and then we started having multiple developers working together, so we needed some kind of version control. Then we had something like the Linux kernel, which was so big and so many people that Git was invented.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of the same with teams now, is that we need better ways of working together. And I think we've always been looking for those anyway, right? There's always improvements. So I think it's been natural, but without doubt, there's been acceleration with the pandemic.
What would your advice to somebody be? Because there's a lot of job movement over the last few months. There's been a lot of sad stories of tech companies, making unfortunate decisions. A lot of people looking for roles. What would your advice be to people who, perhaps want to get into the DevOps industry? They want to, start to learn new skills and get into the software engineering realms and move towards, cloud native engineering, if that even is a thing. What would your advice to them be?
So I think that, well, firstly, I think it's horrible for anyone going through a difficult time. I mean, the pandemic's been very polarizing in some ways, and that it's been great for some companies, not so great for others. It's been great for some people as well, but not so for some others. So if you're in a position where you're looking for a new role and you're thinking that this is the way you're going to go, I think first of all, the good news is that there is a world of content out there that did not previously exist. So whether that is looking at tutorial videos on YouTube, which there's hundreds of hours of, where it's the free lab stuff. So for example, on the Tanzu website, there's a bunch of free labs you can use to learn about the Tanzu product suite. And I'm sure, other providers do the same thing. There's a world of content, first and foremost, that you can use to educate yourself.
Nice.
I think number two is, again, my own personal advice would be think about culture. Think about the type of company that you want to work with and what that means for you. And I think as well, when you're looking at those companies, my advice for all time has been try to surround yourself in really smart people. Ideally, people that are much smarter than you. That's how you learn. That's how you grow.
Yeah.
And I suppose linked to that, don't be scared. I think you need to sometimes do something a little bit new and a little bit exciting, and that moves you on to the next chapter, right? All the big things in my life have come from big risks sometimes. Fortunately, they've all gone well. But I think sometimes you need to think big and take that leap.
And what do you think would make somebody stand out? You're obviously talking to a lot of high-profile development departments and leaders of development departments. There's going to be a lot of applicants now per role, I believe. And what would make somebody stand out? Do you think? What could they do a little bit extra? I mean, you had quite an interesting background yourself, because you exposed yourself to many different technologies, and you learned and you adapted and you applied, and what would your advice to somebody be to make them stand out in the crowd?
So there's two things that I think I can think of. Number one, have a think about your own experiences and what makes you unique. And I think a lot of people think, well, I've not spent 10 years developing software, so therefore I can't be a developer. That's not true. That could mean that you've spent 10 years doing other things, and now that you've learned how to develop software, you can apply those other skills to software development, which makes you unique. So we talk about people's unfair advantage. So have a read on that and think about in your life, what have you got that other people don't have because of the experiences you've got, and really focus on those. Be yourself. I know that's the age-old advice, but what we really mean is think about what makes you great and focus on those things. Specifically, as we were talking about before, I think that many companies are looking for the stereotypical hero to come in and be top of their game all the time. But I think, generally speaking, in large companies and enterprise, we're actually more interested in team players, people that can work really well as part of a team, especially if that team's distributed. I think it's people that are able to think about consumers as customers and be able to talk, be able to write about a subject. So maybe a good way of starting is to write some blog articles. Even if it's a personal blog, write some blog articles. Maybe someone will see what you're doing.
Raise your profile.
Get involved in open source projects. Yeah, do something to raise your profile and show willing. When I'm hiring, I take technology and skills somewhat as a given. If you're going to go through the process, you'll get to a certain point, and really it's your character and your uniqueness that's going to sell you. And it's those people that I think that, if I could be stuck on a plane with you for a couple hours and have a good conversation, that's a good sign, right?
Yeah.
And I think that works well for customers as well. Okay, this comes back to, every department now has customers, and we need to treat everyone as a customer. So think about that.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think we are running out of time, big man. So I think it's been a very informative conversation, to say the least. I think with some good analogies, which hopefully people who didn't know much about Kubernetes will now have some kind of framework understanding, as I now do. I'm thinking about ships and all kinds of crane work. But look, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to seeing some more of your podcasts. I know you're just starting to kind of become quite popular with the podcast community and the blogging community yourself. So if anybody wants to follow you or get hold of your blogs or articles, where would they find those?
So best place to find me is as Bryan Ross on LinkedIn, or if you look on Twitter, you'll find me as Bryan Ross UK. But you reach out, come talk to me. I'm more than happy to find out what you're doing. I'm always interested in other people's experiences and what they're doing with the platforms or problems. And obviously the Tanzu website is where you'll find any Tanzu content that I'm making, alongside the Tanzu YouTube channel, which is obviously a great resource if you're trying to learn more about containers, Kubernetes, and how you can do that without cutting yourself.
Okay,
too many sharp edges.
Yeah, lots of complicated text and scripts and blogs. And what I'll do though is I'll add your LinkedIn to the to when I post this on my LinkedIn, so that anybody that wants to connect with you and say, hey, look, it was great talking, I want to talk about ships and containers, and they know where to find you.
Super, mate.
Awesome.
It's been a pleasure chatting to you, mate.
Bryan, enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for your time, brother.
Have a great day, mate. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.